Okay, let's get started. Let's call to order the SDCERS Board of Administration meeting for Friday, January 13th, 2017. Meeting on Friday the 13th is always interesting. All our meetings are interesting. Cynthia, do we have a quorum?
Yes, we have a quorum.
Okay, we have no non-agenda public comment, so we'll move right into item number 4, approval of consent agenda items A through D. Unless there's a board member wishing to pull an item to discuss independently, I will take a motion for these items. I have a motion from Tom Battaglia, second by Charlie Hogquist.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
And that motion is approved 10-0. All right, moving on to Audit Committee. Lee Paravano is going to provide the Audit Committee report out. Morning, Lee.
The first item was an action requested by the Audit Committee. It was to revise the board process for the review of the internal auditor. Johnny Tran presented the revisions to that process. There was one additional item that was requested by the Audit Committee, and that was incorporated into the new process that that will be reported out with the Business and Governance report out. That item was approved 4-0 by the Audit Committee, but it will be voted on by with the Business and Governance report out.
Okay.
The second item was the elected or appointed trustees on the Audit Committee. The Audit Committee discussed whether or not elected members could sit on the Audit Committee. This item was also discussed at B&G yesterday and will be reported out with that report. The third item was the annual investment compliance monitoring report. Anders Norman gave a presentation to the Audit Committee and discussed State Street Bank's annual compliance monitoring report and the work that staff does on that report and the benefits of that review. This item was previously discussed with the Investments Committee in November 2016. I'm going to cover 3 items together, items 4, 5, and 6. Number 4 is receive and accept the fiscal year 2016 independent auditors report. Number 5 is a mouthful, so give me a second. Receive and accept the fiscal year 2016 independent auditors report on internal control over financial reporting and on compliance and other matters based on an audit of financial statements performed in accordance with government auditing standards. The 6th one was receive and accept the fiscal year 2016 report to the Audit Committee and Board of Administration. Linda Hurley from Macias, Genie and O'Connell, or MGO, is our external financial auditors. They issued those 3 reports in connection with the audit that they performed. They gave us an unmodified opinion, which is the highest level of assurance that SDCERS can achieve. So this was a great accomplishment by our staff. There was 3 things that I just wanted to note that she had commented on as well. 1, that there was no findings with our report. 2, that there was no difficulties encountered with management. And 3, that there was no misstatements noted in the entire audit. The Audit Committee complimented finance staff and our entire staff as a whole. They were really pleased with the results of the audit. There were 3 status reports. There was the IT report was presented by Dave Bond. That will be presented with the B&G report out. The Legal Services Compliance report, that will be also done with the B&G report out. And I gave my internal audit staff report. There was 2 items I noted in there. One was that I was behind on 2 audits that were ongoing. The second one was that I didn't think that the delay in these 2 reports would have a substantial impact on the rest of the audit plan. I'd be happy to answer any other questions.
Nobody in the queue? Thank you, Lee.
Sure.
Okay, we'll move on to business operations. The presentation of the June 30th, 2016 actuarial valuation results. And here comes our star of the show, Gene Kowarski.
Just want to make a comment that folks living in D.C. are always criticized by New Englanders that when it snows, they panic and all that. But I've come to San Diego all these years. We have a drop of rain and you all have umbrellas. You don't know how to handle rain.
No. And did you say something about snow? What's that?
So, for the new board members, my name is Gene Kalwarski, and with me is David Holland, Alice Ellsberg. We're the team that performs the annual evaluation for the San Diego City Employees Retirement System, as well as the plans for the Unified Port District and the Airport Authority. And this is the 12th year that we're presenting valuation results. And I'm on slide, let me go back to slide 1. I'll go over some background issues along with David, and then Alice is going to talk about historical trends, then we'll get into the valuation results. But the most important part, I think, of our presentation is looking forward and looking at some projections and where the system might be going. We always show this tank that appeared in the Harvard Business Review in 1965. And it's our depiction of what an actuarial valuation is. We take a snapshot each year of the plan, and we collect census data from the participants, or from the system on the participants, and we have the financial information, and we measure it in the size of this tank, and that's the liabilities of the fund. And then the water in the tank are the assets, and then we look at the benefit payouts and expenses and the investment earnings, and using all those levers there, there's a tweaking each year of the employer contributions and possibly employee contributions because the system has substantially equal contributions. And this is the one-year snapshot evaluation that we're doing. The way the evaluation results work is that we're now presenting here on January 13th the valuation results, and they'll be used to determine the cities, the other plan sponsors, UPD and the airports, contributions that are paid on July 1st, 2017. David will take you through the rest of the background.
So the slide you're seeing here just gives you some sense of the complexity of SDCERS. We're showing all the different tiers for each of the 3 plan sponsors. You can see that some groups have up to 5 different plans that members are in. For the city, of course, everybody except the police those plans are closed to new hires. And then the port and the airport, they're going into the plan that was created by PEPRA several years ago. Assumption changes for this year. So there were two sets of assumption changes. In 2015, the board adopted a plan to take the discount and wage inflation rates down from 7.25% to 7% over 2 years, and the inflation from 3.3% to 3.05% over 2 years. So for this second year of that plan, we're taking those rates down to 7% and 3.05%. And if you recall, in September, you adopted the results of our experience study, our 5-year experience study. There were a number of changes to different assumptions, but really the key was adopting new mortality tables. You moved from some older tables called the RP 2000 tables to variations of the CalPERS mortality tables that were now incorporating a projection of mortality from 20 years, or a 20-year projection using a scale that came out from the Society of Actuaries. And those changes, as we discussed then, and we'll get into further in this presentation, they result in significant increases to liabilities and costs. With this valuation, we also recomputed member contribution rates. If you recall, for the city, there's a substantially equal requirement in their city charter that requires that certain components, certain benefit components that members pay half, and then there are other components that the city pays the whole cost. And we'll explain more when we get to the appendix. We have preliminary tables for each of these plans, and we'll explain some of the changes that you're seeing in those rates. For the UPD and APA, other than the PEPR members, there are no specific cost-sharing requirements, and so those rates were not changed in spite of these new actuarial assumptions. But for members under PEPRA, the legislation that came out 4 years ago, there's a requirement that you test the aggregate normal cost percentage, determine if there's been more than a 1% change since the time when the rates were first established. So for the port and the airport, we did that test, and although their normal cost rates went up, it wasn't enough that you reached that threshold. And so those member rates continue to remain unchanged. And so at this point, I'll turn it to Alice to go through the historical trends.
All right, the next few slides we see, we'll go over some of the history of the plan through these series of graphs. So the first one we have here shows the assets and liabilities for the city. The blue bars represent the liability, the actual liability of the plan, and the lines are the assets. So we have two lines for assets, the market value of assets, the bluish line, and then the actuarial value of assets, which is the asset smoothing, the yellow line. And you'll see that across the period, there are times where the actuarial value of assets is higher than the market value, times where the actual value of assets is lower than the market value, and that's when we're recognizing just a portion of the gains or losses to have a smoothing over the period. The percents, the ratios at the top of the graph are that's the funded ratio of the plan. So the funded ratio shows the ratio of the assets to the liabilities. So essentially, it's telling us what the gap is between the asset to the actuarial liability there.
The market value or the smoothed value?
The smoothed value. Thank you. So it's on
They're
the.
just about identical in 2016.
Yeah, we'll see where the dots for the market value and actuarial value, they do converge, or they're fairly close. So you're getting a similar funded ratio there. So in the beginning of the period that we have shown here, the city was close to full funding for several years. And then in 2000, 2001, some changes were made to the benefits of the plan. There was a market downturn, and the funded ratio dipped. It was progressing over time, and there was a window of time where the city was not making its full contribution. There were less assets coming into the plan, and so that contribution, the funded ratio stayed a little bit lower. We come to 2009, 2010, again, we see a significant dip, and that's the market crash in 2008 that was the driver there. And then in 2015, we saw that the funded ratio climbed to the 75.6%, whereas in 2016, it dropped back down to 71.6%. And David and Jean will explain the details of that change. But as David said, with the experience study, the changes in assumptions, mortality, discount rate, increase the liability, which decreases the funding ratio there. Here we show the contributions that the city has been making over the period before us. We have the gold bar, which represents the ADC that was paid by the city. And then the combination blue bar is the ADC that was calculated. And let's just focus on, we'll take a look at the fiscal year 2017, so that we could talk through the components. So the lighter blue, that's the normal cost, so just the cost of the benefit accrual each year. The dark blue is the UAL payment for the year, and then the red or maroon at the top is the administrative expenses. And you'll see that, so in 2017, the ADC was $261.1 million, and the city paid that in full. And you'll notice from 2006 to present, the city has been paying that contribution in full. The 2018 fiscal year ADC is $324.5 million. And again, you'll hear more about those results in the coming slides.
Real quick, I'm going to jump in here. So if I love this presentation every year. I'm sorry.
Good. We like questions.
I think it's really important, and we don't like to look back too much on our history, but if you look at 2003, 2004, 2005 on this chart, and you look at the what was paid and what was necessarily due, and you flip back a page,
Right.
and you see the funding ratio start to dip, they're at the same time frames.
Exactly. So you'll see.
And we've never fully recovered from that.
And it wasn't just the shortfall contributions, there are also increases in benefits in that.
Right. Now the increase in benefits effectively occurred more in the late 90s, if I recall.
Yeah.
Right, and so you'll see that in 2001, it dipped from the 97 to the 89.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But it wasn't until the payments really started being shortened that we saw the decrease in the funding ratio. So, okay, thank you.
Just on that chart on page, the one that's up there now, it might be nice if you were to put some lines going down and put a little explanation of what caused it. So in other words, the unfunded years were what, about 3 years or something like that? Or the lower funded years, unfunded, I'm not, if you could do that, and then.
You mean like show above 2009 market decline?
Market,
Yeah.
right.
I could
right.
put all my chicken scratch on there.
Yeah, I mean, it would be helpful
Yeah.
to the reader because they'd see why the unfunded ratio
No,
changed.
that's a good point, because it would show historical
Yeah,
perspective. So, which is important, because I think, as you mentioned, since 2006, the payment has been fully made, which has been key to making the system healthy again. So, thank you.
All right, and here we take a look at the gains and losses for the city. So the gold bars are the investment gains and losses, and then the blue bars are the liability gains and losses on the actuarial liability. And clearly, the investment gains and losses have much more significant fluctuations over time, whereas the liability gains and losses, those stay closer to zero. And you can see that as a percent of liability in the right-hand column. The blue right-hand column shows the percent of the actuarial liability. So how far off were the liabilities from the assumption? How far off was the experience from the assumed versus the investment gains and losses there? So let's see, from 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16, on the liability side, we were seeing losses. And when an experience study comes into play like we did last year, that's serves to alleviate those losses going forward, hopefully. Yeah.
Just wanted to add that those losses that you're seeing in that same time period are primarily mortality losses, pointing out the reason why we needed to do that experience study and change the assumption. So we've been seeing this trend for a while.
And if you look at the gold column, you see how dramatic that 2008 market crash was, 19.4% of assets.
Right. And just to clarify, a liability loss is an increase in liability cost.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So you could call it a liability gain.
Liability gain.
All right, and now we'll be moving on to the Port District for their historical trends. It's similar pattern to what we saw with the city. The Port had really good full funding. You'll see from 1995 until 2001, they were very well funded. 2002 came along. There were benefit improvements in addition to investment losses, and that caused that dip in their funded ratio. And then again, we move on to the 2009 due to the 2008 crash. We see that large dip in the funded ratio. Steadily, the Port was climbing in terms of the funded ratio, and we had in 2015, they were funded to 78.8%, and then 2016, the current valuation is 74.4%. Again, that drop in the funded ratio driven by the change in assumptions, so the liability increase from the assumption changes.
They had a very similar pattern to the city.
The one thing I would add, though, the port and the airport have always paid their ADC, so there's never been any reason why the funding ratio has dipped because they weren't paying their ADC. They have always paid it.
And the contributions show that. So where the gold bars always match up or are slightly higher than the blue stacked bars, we see that the Port has been paying their full contribution year over year. Now, something different that we didn't see as prominently on the city is the member contribution here for the Port District. So you see that the member contribution is the green and pink bar stacked. That's the sum of the member contribution, but the Port offsets or picks up a portion of that member contribution and pays it on behalf of the member. So you'll see the portion of the offset, the pink, that's paid for by the employer. Now, under PEPRA, member offsets are no longer permitted, so slowly we'll see a fading of the size of the pink bar where the members will be picking up the majority of their contribution amount. Gains and losses for the Port, again, we see the similar fluctuations, really the more significant movement from the investment gains and losses, But on the actuarial side, the port has, just in a snapshot in recent years, has been fluctuating gains, losses, and that's what we like to see. But generally, the theme is that there has been more losses across the board, again, with the mortality that needs a improvement in the assumption there. All right, and moving on to the Airport Authority. The Airport Authority spun off from the port and then aggressively made contributions to really move up their funding ratio. So we see that 2003-04, they were in the 60s, bumped straight up in 2005 to the high 80s, and then maintained some full funding for a steady period there until the market crash. And since the Port Authority has its own funding policy that whenever they fall below 90% in their funded ratio, they make additional contributions to pick themselves back up. They have a set structure on how to contribute to increase their funding ratio. And then if they fall below 95%, they have a different trigger to increase their funding ratio with additional contributions. So we see starting in 2015, the airport was at the 97.2%, so they were within the safe zone, so to speak, of their funded ratio. But now in 2016, they've dropped below the 90%. They're at 89.4%. So it's assumed that the airport will be making additional contributions above the ADC to meet their policy.
And to reiterate, that's because of the mortality change.
Yes, and again, that big dip, the change in the assumption, so mortality was the big driver, and then the discount rate, the additional 0.1% that we saw go down this year. All right, and contributions from the airport, we see some additional contributions that really stick out made in 2005, 2010. That's, again, the airport trying to reach that full funding. Always making the contributions to meet at least the ADC, if not more. And different for the airport, we see that the light blue bar on the contribution on the ADC, the calculated contribution for the airport, the majority of their payment is normal cost. And they've had a small portion of UAL. We see that dark blue at the top. That's the piece of their unfunded payment that they're making. In the fiscal year 2018 payment, the normal cost is still the substantial portion of their ADC, but that UAL payment did grow, again, driven by the assumption changes. All right, and we see gains and losses for the airport. The investment gains and losses, those we're going to see that same pattern as through all plan sponsors. It's the liability that each plan sponsor's individual experience is going to show differently in terms of the liability experience. Now, the liability experience for the airport, if you look at the column, the percent of fluctuation on the experience from the assumed liability, they're going to have a little bit more gains and losses because they're a lot smaller plan. So if we're talking about less members, it's harder to hit the assumption target. So we will see more fluctuation in the gains and losses from the airport, just given the size of the plan. And I'll turn it over to Jean and David.
So now we get into the valuation results, which you actually already saw a peek of with Alice's charts, and I'm on slide 19. So this is the summary of all the key valuation results. The top dark blue is the membership data, then the gray are the assets and liabilities, and then the gold are the contributions. We have a decline in a number of actives. That's to be expected with the closed portion of the plan. You see average salary didn't change much, but that's a little misleading. As we get into the sources of change, you'll see there were some losses due to salary we'll talk about shortly. On the liabilities, the actual liability went up more than 11%, and a lot of it's due to the mortality. The investment performance, you did not achieve your 7%, or was it 7 1/8, I guess, for the year, and that resulted in your funded ratio. Let me back up a second. There's three columns up there. The 2015 is the first column. 2016 is what would have been expected if there were no gains and losses, but we knew we were going to have the 7% discount rate. And the third column is with the 7% discount rate and reflecting the mortality and other assumption changes and the experience for the year, the investment loss as well as the liability loss. That's where we ended up. So the actuarial funded ratio went from 75.6 to 71.6. That was analysis charts. If you measured it on a market value, you'd be at 70% funded. And the ADC went from 261.1 million up to 324 million. It's probably the second largest spike we've had in the 12 years we've presented. Mark, you told me that would have been 2009, would have been the largest one. So the sources of change, we've got liability changes, asset changes, and subtract assets from liabilities. You have the UAL, and then the AL translate to the ADC. And we would have expected the actual liability to increase even with no changes, and then by 210 million. This is the first column. With a 7% discount and 3.05 inflation, we estimated an additional 99.5% increase. But then the big hit was the mortality and assumption changes of 444.3 million. And then the losses for the year, the 49.7, which is largely mortality and salary increases. I don't know, Mark, if you want to say anything more about that, but we dove into the data, and there was a large group of people that had salary increases well over what we would have expected.
Yeah, there's pay range freezes in place for the city of San Diego, and for the last couple of years, we haven't seen much in the way of salary increases. This past year, there appear to have been a number of promotional increases. I know in the fiscal 2016 budget, the city added some additional positions, and employees may have promoted into that. So there were a number of people that got promotional increases, which is influencing why there was a small salary loss.
Gene, I had a question. On the ADC of 324.5, the last number I recall was 311. What was the change on that?
I don't recall 311. Would that have been, I had the September.
You're probably thinking of September presentation.
Yeah.
With the new assumptions and the investment experience.
Yeah.
That would be 311 or 312. So if you look at this slide, part of that, if you look at this fiscal year 16 liability experience, the 49.7 on the liability, and then you move over to the right where it says, it shows 6.6 for the ADC. So that's a little more than half of that difference as we had adverse liability experience for the year.
When we came here in September, we were basing it all off the 2015 val. So now we've got the 16 val where we've got new results, as David mentioned, new liability experience that we didn't anticipate back then.
Okay.
I want to go back real quick to the salary increase component, because the way I understand the way we calculate our liability for salary increases, there's two components to it. There's the general salary increase, we call it wage inflation, and then there's a merit increase that captures step increases and promotions. And so did we miss the mark on our merit increase is what we're saying here is why we saw salary?
I think it's a combination of both.
A combination of both. Okay, well, and then this is where I get a little challenged, because if I recall, all of the MOUs that the city signs come over here for an evaluation on their impact on the pension system. And council doesn't really approve the MOUs unless they get that letter from SDCERS that says there's no pensionable impact. So if we are telling the city, hey, there's no pensionable impact on these MOUs, how could it be a little both?
Well, you could have people getting internal promotions that aren't part of the MOU. And,
So that's my point. So if it's promotions, is that in the merit
that would
assumption?
Be in the merit. Promotions are in the merit.
Okay, so it's in the merit assumption, so that's not our wage inflation assumption per se, because that would be the general salary increases that the employees are getting. I mean, we have a separate assumption for merit increases, which are step increases and promotions.
Yes.
And so what we're seeing here is in the step increases and promotions assumption.
Yes, in fact,
Okay.
I probably misspoke when I said wage inflation, because your average wages did not go up by much if you look at the slide before that.
Right, okay. I just want to make that clear because there's been a salary freeze in place, and there's been a
Right.
lot of work done to ensure that that salary freeze has stayed in place. And so,
I think Mark stated there was like 17% of the population experienced a 5% or greater salary increase, and that would have been a merit component and not inflation.
right. Well, there's a whole other topic we can talk about why promotions are occurring at such a high rate in the city, but that's,
Right.
okay. Thank you, Gene.
So the bottom line is ADC is now up to 324, and Bill, thank you for asking that question, because that was a difference between now and September, given that we have the new valuation here. And we also base the demographic changes when we came here in September based on the 7 1/8% discount rate. Now we're down to 7, so those same demographic changes are going to be more expensive. So David, you want to cover the unified port and the airport?
Sure. All right, so looking at the same table we looked at for the city, showing results for the Unified Port District. Again, the first column is last year's actual results. Middle column is the expected results at 7%. And then the final column is the actual results with at 7%, all the new demographic assumptions and all the actual experience for the year ending fiscal 16. There was a decline in the active population, a slight decline in the active population. The average pay went up somewhat, and you'll see this with all three plan sponsors. There was an increase in the inactive membership, more retirees, more annual benefits, just as the plan matures. The liability went up by about 30 million more than we anticipated. Again, it's the same combination of factors as for the city. You had some liability experiences losses, and you had demographic and in this case, it's demographic assumptions if you're comparing the second and third columns. And so the unfunded liability went from 96.2 million to 129.5 million. So on the funded ratio, you went from 78.8 to 74.4. On an actual value basis and on a market value basis, the funded ratio is now 73. So there's some stored investment losses that have not yet been reflected in the actual value of assets, but will be in the coming years. And then finally, if you look at the last row, the ADC increased from 14.6 to 17.7. The sources of change, again, this is a very similar breakdown as the city. Again, the components are very similar. There were expected increases in the liabilities and the assets. They kind of netted out to an expected decrease in the UAL and a slight increase in the ADC. The impact of the assumption changes was to increase the liabilities, increase the ADC. There was adverse asset experience that reduced the actual value of assets by about $5.5 million. Demographic assumptions increased the liability by about $27 million and increased the ADC by about $1.8 million. And then there was a liability experience loss of approximately $1.9 million. And that was mostly driven, like the city, by mortality and also to some degree by rates of decrement or rates of termination or disability and so forth, being somewhat different than expected. So in total, again, you had a loss on the liabilities from the assumptions and the demographic experience, and you had a loss on the assets from only achieving a 1% market return as opposed to the 7 and 8 that was anticipated. For the airport authority, if you look at the top, their membership actually, they had an increase in the number of actives, an increase in payroll, increase in average salary, and they also had an increase in inactive membership as well. Retirees and benefits have been increasing over the years. Looking at the liabilities, the actual liability was about 140 last year and went up to about 166 in 2016. Again, driven by some demographic experience, but mostly by the changes in the assumptions. The unfunded actual liability went up significantly by 3.9, from 3.9 to 17.6 million. Again, last year they were close to being 100% funded. They were about 97%. So when you increase the liability significantly, you get the UAL can increase by several times what it was. So the funded ratio went from 97.2 to 89.4, as Alice mentioned earlier. And like the other two plan sponsors, you have a market value funded ratio that's somewhat less than the actual value. So there are losses that still need to be reflected in your actual value of assets. For the contributions, the ADC last year was $37,65,000, and then for fiscal 18, what we're coming up with is just over $5.4 million. Looking at the sources of change, again, it's a largely similar story as the port and the city. You would expect an increase in assets and liabilities that more or less netted out on the UAL and ADC, so we weren't anticipating a significant change. But we did have the reduction in the discount rate and the wage inflation rate that increased the liabilities, increased the ADC. Return of 1% reduced your actual value of assets by about $1.7 million. You have the new demographic assumptions, which increased the liability by just over $10 million, increased the ADC by just over $1 million. Liability experience loss of about $450,000 that was mostly driven by salary increases that were over what was expected, partly offset by COLAs for retirees being a little bit lower than the 2% that we assume. And then you had a small increase in the negative amortization payment, which is basically it's a payment to ensure that you're always paying principal on your UAL. And the airport, it's somewhat technical, but due to the way their amortization bases are structured and the fact that their UAL is very small, it's much closer to being 100% funded than the other two. They were in a position where their payments weren't sufficient to meet interest on the UAL, and so that payment is there, and it kind of goes up or down over the years. But in this particular year, it was such that it increased by about $100,000. And so in total, if you look at everything, again, the UAL for the port is just over $17 million, and the ADC is about $5.4 million.
So we spent a lot of time looking backwards in this year versus last year, but we always end our presentation with projections. And I'll first go through the baseline projections. And for the new board members, I'll give you a sense of what you're looking at here. There's two graphs on your screen. The top graph are a projection of the liabilities of the plan, and the lines are the assets. The gold line would be the smooth value, and the market value is the green. And the very top of that chart shows the funded status, where the plan is heading towards 100% funded. The bottom graph are the the employer plan sponsor contribution as well as the member contribution. And we've had extensive discussion about the fact that for the next 10 years or so, there's a large, over $300 million of plan sponsor contributions, and then there's a significant drop in the out years. And again, this is based on the plan earning 7% each year and every single year, and that's not going to happen. We're going to have up and down returns. So what we've done, if you could switch to the model, we have a live model that says, I don't know, Mark, do you know what the returns or what the returns are year to date?
3.9%.
That's for the first quarter. Yeah.
So, sorry. If, I'll go both ways. If the fiscal year ending 2017 is we're going to change the return, but focus on the column that says ADC, no, actually, it would be the first 324 and 329, those numbers. So if we change, if we end the year with, let's say, a 0% return, the 324 stays the same because we're setting that today, but the 329 went up to 339. And then if 339, and then if we had the first year be 14%, it's so like a $10 million swing for a return being 7% higher or lower than the assumption. And Alice, if you could hit the historical and start with 1930. This is now looking at what the returns were between 1930 and 1960. So it's a 30-year return, equities and bond performance in that period. The Great Depression would have hit. You would have sunk down to 38% funded, but then market rebound. And just go through the years, Alice. So this is what we call stress testing. And you could see the investment returns just have a super impact on the results of the system. So every year when we come in here and say, these are the numbers, this is, although I keep seeing everything getting rosy at the far right, there's got to be a downside.
Is there a general rule of thumb in terms of the unfunded liability? So if your ratio gets below 70% and starts,
No, I think.
can you make it up?
In the private sector, there are some rules that the government set up, but I know most actuaries will say, no, avoid focusing on the absolute funded ratio. Look at where your projected funded ratio is going. So if I had a plan that was 90% funded versus a plan, let's say, that's 60% funded, but if I looked at the projection, the 60% funded plan over the next 20 years is going to get fully funded, and the 90% plan is going downhill, I'd rather be 60. So that's why I think this is the more important thing to look at, the projections. And did we ever find a period, Alice, that
There we go.
you just keep clicking? I just want to see if there's the 1960s. Well, if history repeats itself, it's saying that you're going to have up and down years, but I think what's happening on the far right is the roaring 90s. Keeps bringing things back.
Is our past performance guaranteeing future results?
The investment people answer? So I think that there's a board retreat coming up, and it's likely that we'll, well, actually, I won't be there. I'll be skiing in Switzerland, so.
We'll be able to play with the variables in more detail.
Yeah.
Right.
Can we
So-
go back to the chart that we started with, our baseline chart for this year? I have a couple of things I'd like to, I think these charts are great, and I think Gene pointed this out, that it's trying to lock in on the funding ratio, because this is a snapshot. It's a picture of where we are today. Just like taking a picture of a person, you can't tell their health by looking at their picture, generally. And so it's about where we're going. I think what's important, I always find it interesting, because I've been here for 8 of your 12 years, and one of my first years was the 2009 valuation. And if we pull up this chart from 2009, the ADC with those assumptions then, I think was $380 million for FY18. So I guess I'm a glass half full, because the way I look at this, we've saved the city $60 million roughly from what we were doing in 2009. But it also points out the fact that don't get too caught up in the projections farther and farther away.
Yeah.
Because the farther you go, the less accurate the projection is. And so next year's, obviously 324.5 is going to be the payment this year. But 329.3 in FY19 is in the ballpark. And the farther we go, the ballpark gets bigger and bigger and bigger.
And then we drop.
Yes.
You want to stress test the other plan sponsors? You can go straight to the model, yeah.
All right, so this is the projection for the port. Again, assuming 7%, you can see the funded ratio is starting at 74, projected to go up to just under 100% by the end of the period. There's not as much of, if you look at the bottom chart, there's not as much fluctuation in the employer contributions. There is somewhat of a cliff in around 10 years, but it's not as big as the city, and then the contributions are pretty steady going forward. If I switch over, well, I guess I could show you the same scenarios that we did. So if you focus on the 18.4 for fiscal 19,
That's the ADC column, the green column.
yeah, actually 18.4, not 19.4. Yeah, 18.4, the ADC column, 18.4 for fiscal 19. If I change the return to 0, you can see it goes up by 600,000 to 19 million. And then if you achieve plus 7%, it goes down to 17.8. So it's about a $600,000 swing for a 7% difference in the return. If I switch over to the airport, this chart's pretty different, because you can see the top chart, again, the funded, and of course, this doesn't reflect their funding policy. The airport's funding policy is their own. It's not the SDCERS board's policy. So this may not be an accurate reflection of what actually happens. They may get to better funded ratios sooner. But if you look at the top chart, there's kind of a much bigger increase in assets and liabilities as this plan continues to grow in size. They do get to just under 100% funding by the end of the period. The contributions are just more or less steadily. There's some increases and decreases over the period as bases are coming in and out, but more or less the contributions for the members and the employers are just kind of going steadily up over time because it's, again, as Alice said before, you have mostly a normal cost payment, and that's just kind of steadily going up as membership goes up and payroll increases over time. And if I show you, so again, focusing on the ADC column, the 5.6 million that we anticipate for fiscal 19, if I put in a 0% return, that goes up to 5.7. If I put in 14, 5.4. So there's not a whole lot of swing, even for a pretty substantial difference in the return.
So the board's practice is for us to come in January and present these preliminary results and give the board until the March meeting to deliberate, and it's not until the March meeting that any action's required. And I anticipate there might be some activity or looking at this at the retreat in February as well.
Could be. And then additionally, Gene and I will be presenting the valuation results to the city in early March, so they'll have a chance to take a look at it. And then in a few weeks, Marcel and I will be appearing at the airport for a board meeting there to share the information with the airport board. Historically, the port hasn't asked us to do that, but we're available if they would like to.
Any questions? Jeff?
In this March meeting, are we going to revisit the methodology like we did for the FY18 payment?
That's not the plan at this point, Jeff. In September of every year is when we go through a review of our economic assumptions, which is the discount rate and the wage inflation rate. In September, we'll also be looking at what the fiscal year 17 investment returns were and the impact on the valuation. And I think it'd be appropriate at that time to say, given X for investment returns and given Y relative to where we think the discount rate should be, what does that do to the long-term trend of the three plan sponsors' ADC payments, and is there any kind of spikiness that we think would be appropriate for us to deal with? So long answer short, the plan is to review the actuarial funding changes in September. If the board all wants to revisit the issue that we talked about last fall about this whole step down or phase in plan, that's up to you, but I hadn't planned on bringing that back before the board until September.
I think that would be a good idea because at that time that we did vote for the methodology, there was only 10 of us here, and now I see a lot of new faces on this board, and the payment schedule is pretty dramatic from, fiscal year 16 all the way to fiscal year 2025, and I think it would be worth revisiting with a new group of members here. Just opinion.
So that's a fair point, Jeff. Thank you. Gene, could you just go through briefly the methodology that the board put in place for the benefit of our new board members? Because we did have a long discussion about the step down methodology.
We were here in September. If you look at the chart that's up there now, the bottom chart, we pointed out that going from 2017 to 18, there was a significant spike in the contribution, as we presented today, the 324. And we spent a lot of time with the board going over some options to take those first 10 years of spiked gold bars and instead of having in 2028, I think, or 2029, there's a dramatic drop from over 350 million down to 150 million or so. Well, it's in the green column, actually. The employer contribution would go from 330 million down to 119. So that's a $200 million drop. And we provided some options to lower the contributions in the early years so that there isn't such a significant drop. And we presented two options. One is a step down from that highest gold bar, the 330, down over 5 years, which would result in lower contributions in the early years. And option two was to simply phase in what you're seeing going on between 2017 and 18, the 261 to 324, we'd phase that in over 5 years. So we spent a lot of time just explaining the pros and cons of that. And then At the end, there was, the board voted, but there was only 7 board members here at the time, I believe.
No, I think we had 9.
9.
And I think there were 6 in favor of an optional, and we needed 7 votes to make a change to the policy. So we're on, the funding policy that we see now is the policy that or the practice that's always been existed. And so in September, there was a vote to change the practice to lessen the impact of the mortality assumption being brought into the valuation by using the drop-off in the later years. The vote passed by a majority of board members, of 6 board members, but failed because the board needs 7 votes to take an action. So I think it was 6-3, I believe, may have been 6-4. 6-4.
4, yeah.
So out of the 10 board members, 6 wanted to change it, 4 did not, but we need 7 to take an action. So that's what Jeff is referring to.
And also of those 10 people that were here, it's going to be changed next time we meet to review this, and I think it's worth our whole new group of board members to revisit it.
Right. What I would suggest, because it does get quite technical, and given that this is just a presentation of the valuation today, that would be a great opportunity for board members at the retreat to maybe ask questions on the technical side, because it gets long in explanation. So, would you agree, Bill? I mean, because I know you were on the 4 side of the 6 vote.
I think I, for one, am not in favor of revisiting. I think
Right.
that we spent a lot of time, it is a technical area. We made the decision, and the board practice is to review it again in September. And I think we should stay with the board practice and not try and make changes along the way, just because of a couple months difference or a couple new board members. So that's where I am
Right.
coming from.
So the process is, this is a presentation, and then we will approve the valuation in March. And that would, at that point, lock in the ADC payment for the 3 plan sponsors. So,
And I
Natasha?
just wanted to add too, we didn't have the numbers at that time. We were looking at the 311.
Right.
And so there is a dramatic change even there. So I would just offer that as something that is different from past years in the practice that occurred. I actually do have a clarification question. On page 20, you were talking about the 49.7 million was a result of mortality and salary. What percentage was mortality?
30 million.
30.
And the salaries were 26, so that adds up to like 56, but there were other offsetting gains.
Okay. And out of the 26, that was salary steps and promotional?
No, I think through Alan's question, it's largely almost all
Almost all
promotion.
promotion.
did you have more, Natasha?
No.
And then, Tasha, with the mortality change, we wouldn't expect the mortality liability experience loss in future years. So picking up the 443 is to avoid having future mortality losses.
Well, and I know Mark had made a comment about we have been seeing the trends coming. Why wouldn't we have taken that into account in previous years so that the hit wouldn't be quite so dramatic?
Well, I think the real reason is that we were basing our mortality in previous experience studies based on San Diego's population, and the Society of Actuaries conducted these massive studies in 2014, 15, and 16 that looked at the whole U.S. population, and so it was the major effort by the actuarial profession to, you're seeing this throughout the country, this mortality thing. And the big thing is, what we were doing is looking at your experience and adjusting the assumptions of your experience, and what the Society of Actuaries study demonstrated is you not only need to look at the experience, but you need to figure that, I don't know if you recall me showing these graphs showing that people were born in the 1900s, born in the 1950s, and everybody's living to older and older ages, so there's a push to have generational mortality assumptions introduced into the thing. But if you look at the number, it is a big number, but it's about 5.4% of your liabilities. So it's I'm not saying it's insignificant, but it's not like it's the introduction of generational mortality improvements that's really the key here. We're not only we're anticipating each generation of people living longer.
And that's a significant change from how we used to calculate our mortality assumption.
Yes.
I think, like I said, as Gene's been coming here for 12 years, I think this mortality issue has been something that I know I've been anticipating for many years now. With improvements in healthcare and technology, people are living longer, and that's going to put some pressure on a lot of the pension systems around this country.
And
I think it's appropriate to bring in the mortality assumption, get ourselves up to date. I have other issues with how it's being characterized publicly about the payment. So sorry, Natasha.
And
this is
there's
your time.
There's a lot that if you Google pension mortality improvement, you'll find lots of articles on this. It's actually controversial too in some quarters, or people are saying that the profession went too far. We didn't take your mortality all the way to where the generation tables would take you, so it's a little bit of controversy in our own profession on this.
Bill?
One of the issues I had was in a newspaper reporting a while back, they showed the unfunded portion, the contribution at 160 million or something, and versus the 311. And I asked Mark about that. And there's a general fund portion, and then there's a portion that is agencies or other. You may be able to explain it better.
Fund, that's correct.
Yeah. And so what's the difference there? How much was the general fund? Because the paper reported the general fund, and I was keyed in on the 311, and it was much lower.
That's right. So the total city number is the 324.5 that you see up there. And then the city has a budgetary practice where they identify what are considered general funds versus enterprise funds. Enterprise funds would include agencies that have the ability to increase tax rates to offset expenses, for example. So the general fund is the number that many times internally within the city they focus particularly at. And I'm looking at Natasha or maybe Marcel. I believe the general fund is maybe 80% of the total city budget.
Oh, I think it's less than that. I think that
Mary's looking at me. 73, you said, Mary? 73%.
73% of the total number is the general fund.
the 80 of the ADC number.
Of the ADC,
yes.
yeah.
So I think just from the point of view of the board members, if you're looking at some of the newspaper articles now and then, the numbers look different, but there's generally a reason behind it. You just have to understand what the different enterprise fund and the general fund and where it's coming from.
Thanks, Bill, because I think that's very important that the numbers get put in the proper context. Because 325 million is less than 10% of the citywide budget of 3.4 billion or 3.3 billion. And then if you carve out the general fund portion of the ADC, which is roughly 235 million, 233 million, somewhere in there, that's less than 20% of the general fund budget. So it's important to put these things in context, because I think a lot of people will allow this number to just be thrown out there without the right context and let people believe that this number is crushing to the city's ability to provide services. And in my perspective, it's not a significant part of the budget, of the overall budget. In my opinion, now obviously everybody has their opinion about what it takes to operate a city, but those are my thoughts. So, Bill?
Well, I think the issue is the unanticipated.
The unanticipated
number.
Increase, yes.
Correct, and the fact that the phase-in would have gotten us to the same point.
Right.
At the end of the day.
Yes. Well, yeah, going back to the discussion about the action we took in September, when Gene talked about the health of the system and where we're going, that became a large part of the discussion in September was adopting a different funding methodology without damaging the health of the system. And he presented things, and I think the 6 members that voted for the change felt that we could change that methodology without hurting the path of the system and still maintain a healthy system. So, sorry, Tanasi? Were you done, Bill?
I'm done.
Okay. Awesome.
Natasha, I was just going to mention that I think that we have seen these trends on the horizon, and I think we have been dealing with them here. The difference is, and I say that because this has always been part of the debate. Even before we had the studies, we all knew that this was a looming issue, and I think that the actions that we took as a board on other issues, discount rates, funding issues, all those things, we did the best we could with the information we had to take that into consideration. The difference of what I think you're seeing is now we have the studies, now we have the actual calculation tool, now we actually have the data, and now you say, oh, okay. Now we can debate whether we did enough back then or whether we should have done more or should have done less or whatever the case is, but that's different than knowing that there was a trend and taking no action. I think we did take action. We just, and I think to this day, from the last vote in September, there are those people who think that we should have taken more action, and those people who think we should have taken less action. So, I mean, that's the issue. And I will just add on my 2 cents with, I appreciate that we have new board members, but in my way of thinking, we had 10 very seasoned board members who'd been on this panel for quite some time. Several of them have left or are leaving, and they had probably the most knowledge you could have about this subject matter and the most exposure to it, and it was a hotly contested issue. I was one of the ones that voted for phasing it in. That's because I understand the actuarial calculation to a degree of how the long-term effect is. At the end of the day, process is important. We review this every September. And good, bad, or indifferent, I mean, there's a lot of things that could have affected it. The mayor could have appointed, the city council could have approved, we could have found other candidates, whatever it was. We were all doing the best we could, and we had 10 board members. All right. Sucks to be us, I guess. I think it's a legal term of art. So the answer becomes, I don't think it makes a lot of sense for us to start changing our procedure and our policy. It is what it is. It was what it was. We may very well change it in September, but I don't think it's worth the brutal exercise, especially with a bunch of board members. And I don't mean to take anything away from anybody who's new, but it was a tough decision for those of us who've been sitting here 4 years, 8 years, 7 years, 6 years, whatever the case is. If you're brand new into it, I remember when I was brand new into it, oh my God, and I have a degree in finance, and I have an understanding of actuarial calculations, and it was difficult to get my arms around. So I don't know that doing that is going to be a fruitful exercise. So anyway.
Thanks, Tanasi. Bill?
Yeah, I think the only other point I'd make is that if there were what I would call a significant change, and significant becomes, in my mind, if this whole thing changed 10% or something like that, but the change was 13 million on 311 million, that to me is not a significant change. So I don't see any reason to revisit for an insignificant change.
Right, and I think that from our perspective, I would agree. That doesn't seem like a significant change, but in the budgeting process, every dollar, every penny is accounted for, and when we provide these changes, that means that something has to get cut from the budget. That's truly what it means, whether it's library service, police, fire, park and rec, or wherever, both from general fund and from the enterprise fund departments, which are water, sewer, I believe golf courses, that type of thing. Now, golf courses may not be a necessity, but definitely water and sewer, I think are, so, in my opinion.
It's San Diego. Golf courses are a necessity. They are a necessity.
So,
And
but-
umbrellas.
Yes, and umbrellas. So it just makes it hard on those trying to manage a city budget when they get a number, they're anticipating a number in September of 311, and now there's $13 million more in January, just as the city's beginning, or the port or the airport is beginning their budget process to start July 1. It prevents some significant challenges to balancing the budget, just as though it would for any of us if any of us got hit with a significant bill that we weren't anticipating in our personal lives out of the blue that had to be paid in a couple months. So, and so that's why I think it is significant to go from 311 to 324, maybe because I'm a general fund employee, and I see and feel the effects of those types of changes in the budget. So.
Since we've been talking about 311, 324, just to cement this in, on the chart you're looking at up there right now, the increase in 311 to 324 was because of two pieces. There's the 6.6 liability experience, which we didn't measure until we did the valuation. And then on that 444.3, that's now based on a 7% discount. Back in September, it was on a 7 1/8%. Mm-hmm. So those are the two pieces. We already anticipated the investment loss.
Right. Gene, thank you. Anybody else?
Were you planning to touch briefly on the member contribution rates?
Oh, yes, we did have one more thing. David?
All right, so I won't go through all the slides, but in the appendix, we have the preliminary member rates for each of the city tiers under substantially equal. The rates are set by entry age from 20 to 59 for general, and then from 20 to 49, I believe, for safety. And the first column is just the member rate as a percentage of salary under the old assumptions, and the second column is the member rate under the new actuarial assumptions, and then we show the difference on the right-hand side.
Can I just say something for the new board members, if they're not familiar, the San Diego Municipal Code has a term substantially equal contribution and requires for certain portions of the benefits that there's a 50-50 split in contributions. So when we changed assumptions, if we didn't change member rates, that 50-50 wouldn't be met. So that's why we're presenting this.
Right. So this particular table is old general members. You can see the differences. They range from about 0.5% to 1.1%. They generally go up as the entry age goes up, just as the member rates themselves go up as the entry age is higher. The average is, if you took a weighted average based on when members are typically hired, it's probably about 0.6% for general. And then this is the new general plan. The increases are somewhat higher. For safety, it's I could go through these slides, but it's more or less a fairly consistent story that the rates are increasing, again, for the same reasons that the employer rates are going up, these new actuarial assumptions. And for safety, generally, the differences are about the same as the general increases or a little bit higher. So again, this is available for you to review, but it just shows for every tier what the...
Going back to the safety, Alan, I would, and Tom, I would expect on safety, you don't get many new hires above age 40, do you?
Well, we're not getting any new hires. Tom is getting new hires into the system. I am not.
That's right.
Because fires.
That's right.
The fire plan is closed. But no, we don't.
Most
we get
people
some.
are hired, we're, at least in the past, we're hired in the early, so the later ages really are insignificant.
The average is 26, but we get people starting after finishing a military career and then coming over, so they can be 38, 39 years old.
Okay.
And we're a similar situation in fire.
Just want to add to the point that when Bill and Alan were discussing the impact, the increase in our general fund revenue, just being on the side that is looking at challenges in the upcoming budget, is actually less than the pension increase. So the funds, as Alan was saying, there are going to be tremendous cuts. From 261 to 311 was a big jump already. So that's what I was referring to. I just wanted to clarify that.
Right.
And then anything on the port, or we already talked about it?
We said before that the port and the airport, if you're not in PEPRA, there's no basis to be changing the rates, and then we performed a test to see if the normal cost had changed by a certain amount. There is a requirement in PEPRA that if it changes by a certain amount, you have to recalculate the rates, but they're within that threshold. And so these rates you're seeing, they're only for the city. The rates for the other plan sponsors do not change.
They don't have a substantially equal requirement.
Right.
That's it.
Thank you, Gene.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody else? No? All right. Thank you. Let's do this. Let's do disability really quickly. Natasha, you ready?
I will be.
You will be?
1 second.
And then take a break before B&G? How does that sound?
I think that sounds like a command decision.
Okay. I don't think disability will take very long.
You didn't make that as a captain, as a chief. Yes, you did.
I understand. He's got his own
Okay,
car. He
Alan,
rides
I
around
think I'm
in.
ready.
It's good stuff.
You have your own car now?
I'm ready.
Oh, you not your own little car that you ride around on? The little big
Okay,
SUV, all
I'm-
that? No?
We're going to go ahead and
All
do
right.
the disability
So
report.
let's go ahead and continue on with the disability agenda.
Okay.
Natasha?
The meeting yesterday was fairly short. We had 3 items, and maybe we should wait till
Oh, wait for the
we have
room to
some
clear.
quiet over there.
Okay, people, listen, we're having a meeting up here. Come on, keep it down. Thank you.
My
Accounting, we see what's going on over there.
My sergeant at arms.
Exactly.
Yes. All right, disability. Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you, Tanasi.
Thank you for the patience.
So items 1 through 3 passed unanimously, And let's see, I think the first two items were to approve industrial disabilities, and the third item was to deny an industrial disability retirement application. There really wasn't too much discussion. They were all fairly straightforward. So unless someone has any questions, I will make the motion to move items 1 through 3, and there is no second required.
Oh, wait, sorry.
Oh, Tanasi.
Sorry.
All right, Tanasha, or Natasha, you can, there you go. All right.
Ready to vote?
They moved you here to keep control
All
of what
votes
you
are
do.
in.
That passes 10-0.
10-0.
And Sandra gave a disability status report. Things are going very well. Having the process of allowing staff to refer to adjudicator has helped streamline the process and the time. I know Alan had raised a question of would members have an opportunity to appeal if they didn't want to go straight to adjudicator? And that has not come up, has not been an issue. And I'm looking at Sandra. In the past, and I've, people who've been here longer can verify this or not, we didn't, you don't have to get up. So all the times that you all have recommended referral to adjudicator, has the board ever acted otherwise?
Not that I can recall in 14 years.
Okay, so I thought that was worth a question asking, so we can feel good about that process. And that concludes my report.
All right. Thank you, Natasha. All right, let's take a quick break, 10 minutes or so, and then we'll come back and start up with business and governance agenda.
Did you get this on Amazon? I think I did, yeah. I bought it 4 years ago, so I don't really remember, but I know I bought it online. So I'm assuming.
Get started. We ordered lunch today, so.
I can be annoying in the back. You don't need to wait for me.
Okay, let's get started. Next on the agenda is the Business and Governance Committee. Val Hoy is the chair and chaired the committee yesterday. However, he's ill today, and so in his absence, I will take over. Items 1 through 6 on the Business and Governance consent agenda. Item A2 is approved unanimously with one modification, so I'll pull that one and address it separately. Item A5 received a 2-2 vote, so that will be pulled and discussed separately. And item A6 was not voted on, so that will be pulled as well. So all the other items on the B&G agenda passed unanimously, 4-0. And so as the acting chair of that committee, I will move items A1, 3, and 4, unless a board member wants to pull one of those items. So, seeing none?
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
And that was approved, 10-0. Item A2 concerns a revised board rule regarding actuarial equivalence and a board decision concerning the interpretation of a board rule that is ambiguous. Staff recommended option 1 regarding a clarification of how the board rule is to be interpreted, and the committee voted unanimously to approve the revised rule to adopt option 1. I'll move the item, and a second will be necessary. Is there anybody that has any questions about that item?
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
And that item passed 10-0. Item A5 concerns Ms. Toomey's request to abate interest on an overpayment citing financial hardship. The committee voted 2-2 to approve staff's recommendation to deny. And Susan Youngfish is here briefly to explain the issue. And then we also have a speaker that may or may not want to speak depending on what the board wants to decide here. So Susan, I'll let you go first.
Thank you. Ms. Toomey is the former spouse of a retired general city member. She was overpaid benefits, and she has offered to pay the principal but appeals the amount of interest on financial hardship. In turn, we underpaid the member, and he'll be refunded the amount owed to him. At this time, the system is whole, as the member has not been refunded and Ms. Toomey has not paid. The member and Ms. Toomey have communicated regarding this issue and have been unable to come to an agreement. The staff recommends denying Ms. Toomey's appeal. I'm happy to answer any questions.
So a little bit more on this. So there was considerable discussion yesterday, and the board voted 2-2. In further discussion, an option was to move it back to staff for more work and possibly going back to the city for asking for relief. And so at the committee discussion yesterday, even though it was voted 2-2, there was a discussion about not moving it at the board level and allowing staff to do some more work on it. So I don't know if, Susan, you want to comment on that, or Mark, you want to comment on that?
I do. Staff would recommend still denying the appeal. Obviously, staff is happy to go forward with whatever the board decides, including writing to the city. But historically, the city has always denied paying or forgiving payment of interest for overpayments on behalf of the member and its beneficiaries. So to that extent, by writing to the city to request for forgiveness, or for the city to pay the interest, it's giving Ms. Toomey a false hope, and in the interim, interest will continue to accumulate.
Right. So the vote was 2-2. I was one of the dissenting votes. I think, Tom, you were dissenting vote, and then the other two were Val and Carol. Was it Carol? So just on my piece, I had a lot of concerns over the financial hardship determination and basically glossing over it. But then also was encouraging staff that we've had a change in a policymaker over at the city. And so to rely on the past history of how the city's determined things, I thought was a little quick to decide instead of going back to the city and asking for relief on this particular issue. So, so I voted against staff's recommendation. And then, Tom, if you want to comment, or Carol, as well.
Yeah, go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, I think I was more vocal on the Mr. Mulcahy yesterday in regards to this, but I've always been, and Dick Wilkin supported me on that, is that if there is a responsibility and it's at no fault of the member, and the responsibility is from another city employee, then I always felt that the city has the obligation to fulfill their obligation regarding the error. So I know that we are bound by the IRS guidelines and a variety of other, things in policy and what have you. But and to me, a lot of times, what's right is right, and taking the responsibility away from the city when there was no error or no. The responsibility is not necessarily on the member. The member, went to their meeting and was told this is what your benefit is. And so I just think that there needs to be a different solution a lot of times, especially when you're looking at a hardship.
And Carol, you want to comment?
Well, these situations are always very challenging. I just simply agree with Susan's presentation that in the past, we've never succeeded in these types of requests, and that we're giving false hope to the member,
Right.
or the beneficiary, I should say.
Thank you, Carol. So I have Tanasi in the queue. But like I said, this item, basically, we took no action at committee 2-2, so it's up to the board. So if there's a motion that's made, then we'll move forward on voting. If there's not a motion that is made, then I think we'll end up going back with staff and discussing how we approach the city. So, Tanasi?
Well, the comments that I have is that I think what I found troublesome about the memorandum is I get the fact that there's an overpayment and there's money that's owed, and she's asking for an abatement of the interest. Then the response by staff, and this is not a criticism, is, well, you can't do it because it's illegal. Okay, and I'm not disagreeing with that. What we jumped over, though, was, at least, and maybe I missed it, where was the determination that there's even an economic need for this person? I mean, what was the analysis? What criteria did we use? I mean, are we using the federal rates of the federal poverty rates like the bankruptcy court does? What did she provide? Did she produce financial statements? Did she produce an asset list? Did she produce a liability list? I mean, it's like we ignored that altogether. Why is that important? Whether you go to the city or not, or actually, let me rephrase that. If you're going to go to the city, and I'm not saying it's a good idea, but if you're going to go there, boy, you better have your I's dotted and your T's crossed. You better be going to the city and say, by the way, this woman is making $20,000 a year. She can't, she's been evicted twice. She's something, right? But to go to the city and ask for some relief on behalf of this participant with no information is problematic. Now, that may result in her saying, I don't want to give you that information. Well, that's a different issue. Then we don't think you have a need. Or I'm going to give you that information, okay, and we need to analyze that. On top of it all, it does make a difference for the IRS when you do that homework. If you really make the determination, and especially under the federal guidelines, if she is below the poverty line and you make that and you grant that request, even the IRS on audit isn't going to create a problem for you. They're not going to disqualify the plan because you're going to go to the IRS and say, "What do you want me to do? She doesn't have it." Okay, so I think we've missed an important step in terms of me as a board member being able to analyze it, and also to recommend whether to go back to the city. I agree with your point that we have a change in decision makers, and I don't think that this board should just take the position, well, we weren't ever able to do that in the past, so we shouldn't ever try it in the future. However, I would like to make sure the test case we take to them is one that makes sense, and I want to make sure it's the best foot forward, and I don't have enough information to make that decision today.
So I had that same point yesterday, and I failed to scroll through the dozens and dozens of pages of redacted legal documents because the final page of the item actually has a statement from Ms. Toomey on her economic status.
Yeah. Page 23.
Page 23.
I read the first 5 people.
Yeah,
Come on, I don't know.
No criticism. I made the same mistake
All right.
yesterday, because I was, this is just redacted. I read it, and if I had scrolled one more time, I would have seen that information, yes.
God, I went through, I thought, the vast majority of this. Wow.
I can assist. What I referred to yesterday was Ms. Toomey's letter to Cynthia Queen dated June 29th, 2016. So
Yes.
she did not produce any documents in support of her claims, but she does list her monthly income and the amounts within there that she's claiming financial hardship on.
Oh, okay, so maybe I didn't miss it. I appreciate her statement. Okay, I believe, I think I've read what we're talking about. I didn't see any backup documentation, and I don't know that we can accept just the statement.
Right.
If it was a statement under penalty of perjury, maybe, but without backup documentation, because just because your income is $2,000 a month, you could have $15 million of assets, but only have $2,000 a month in income. I mean, we need to understand this person's balance sheet and income statement to make the determination. The federal rules don't just allow you to just say, she said she only makes $2,000 a month. Okay, so I mean, so I'm not sure that I may have missed it, but okay, good.
Yeah, because the IRS will actually go into all the details.
Of course,
Yeah.
Of course.
Thank you, Tanasi. Johnny, see you in there?
Yeah, thanks. Alan, I just wanted to make sure the new trustees were educated on the current board policy on the corrections. So the current board policy is 100% correction, meaning if we overpay a benefit, that we collect that principal and we also collect the interest. The interest that the board has decided is appropriate is the assumed rate of return authorized by the IRS correction guidelines. The board policy also says we will follow the IRS correction guidelines. So let me give you insight of what that means. The correction guidelines say correct the full amount, including interest. If the member has a hardship described by Thanasi, it's appropriate not to collect from the member, but the IRS asks you then to collect that money from the plan sponsor or another source, if there is one. In the situation where the plan sponsor is unwilling to pay that, the question begs, where does that money come from if you have a hardship and then the plan sponsor won't pay? So that's what your policy says right now. I know that there's been discussion about changing that, but if the board were to follow that policy, it would be 100% correction in this case, including the interest at issue. Thanks, Alan.
Thanks, Johnny.
If I just make a follow-up comment. Johnny, I appreciate you explaining that, but for the entire time I've been on this board, and I think that the vast majority of the people don't like these corrections. We think they're unfair and they're inappropriate, and I want to explain why. There is no way for a member on their own to calculate what their benefit should be. It is impossible. Even if they hire their own actuary, unless they were privy to all of the data that our actuary has to make that calculation, they could not do it even with their own actuary. And so what's frustrating to me as a board member, and what's been frustrating to many of my peers on this board, and which will probably frustrate, I'm going to look in my crystal ball, the new members as they peel back the layers on this, it is frustrating, it is unfair, it's problematic that the board comes in at retirement and says, hey, Mr. Johnson, here's your benefit. And then we say to them some random time later, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years later, we were wrong. Guess what? We've been overpaying you. It's patently wrong. And none of us, the vast majority of us don't like it. The vast majority of us don't support it. And and by the way, some of us, including me, based on my experience both professionally and personally, I think that the policy is inaccurate. And I think the nonsense that we get from some of the professional advisors saying that we have to do this or it's a requirement by the IRS is just not true. And I can tell you from my personal experience, not in the public plan, but in private plans, that the IRS does not take the position that we have been told it takes. And it is, I think, a huge detriment to these retirees, especially when you're talking about someone at this point in their life who's at this stage, who's asked to make these kinds of corrections. It's just wrong. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Could I follow up, Alan? Or
I see Mark in there, too.
There's an item a little bit later on the B&G agenda that we'll get to, but it seems like appropriate if we could take a quick detour and allow me to explain this thing now. The policy that we have on overpayments and underpayments right now is not something that was decided last week or last year. It's been decided by this board over many, many meetings and many, many deliberations with a lot of input from outside fiduciary counsel, outside tax counsel input. And it's been also influenced by past discussions we've had with the city, including letters we've received from the city regarding what their position is. So there is a good reason why we are at a policy that we have today. Now, we can say we don't like it, but I just want you to understand there was a process that led us to get to here, and following this policy. At yesterday's B&G meeting, we had an update to the overpayments and underpayments policy, and the committee decided that they would much rather not take action on updating the policy right now, but to have a further policy discussion about the overpayments and underpayments policy, including some history of how we got to where we are, and to have that discussion at the board retreat. So we made a discussion yesterday to modify the agenda for the board retreat and spend the early part of the meeting providing some context on this issue and allowing us to revisit what do we like, what do we not like about the policy, and is there an opportunity to make some additional revisions to it. So we're going to do that. We have a policy right now, which is in effect, and we may change that policy, but the policy that we have right now is the one upon which we're making this recommendation on Ms. Toomey.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mark. Johnny, did you have more you want to add there?
I was just going to clarify for Thanasi that the B&G committee did ask us to revisit this, and at the retreat, I will share with you in painstaking detail the risk of an optional correction method, but for what that is.
So I'm going to, Bill, so you just jumped in there.
I agree with Thanasi on this, but I think that if we're going to try and overturn this thing and go to the IRS for an audit, we've got to get all the details behind it so we really know what we're doing. Right. I'm very concerned about the overpayment issue. I have been all along. I think it's a hardship for the people that have to make the payment back, and it's particularly if you have somebody who can't do it for some reason or another, it may be good to take one of those and challenge the IRS on it. But you got to have the facts if you're going to do it.
If I could add or comment on that. So just to add to what Johnny has said, and I appreciate your comments, Thanasi, but I want to point out that
You're the only one. Thank you.
California courts have held consistently that a public pension member is only entitled to receive the correct pension benefit amount and not entitled to any more. So if we accept either a lesser rate of interest or waive the interest or go down that route and don't collect the full amount, then essentially we're giving that beneficiary, that member, an additional benefit and depriving the rest of the members from the usage of that money. So I just wanted to make that point.
I'd be happy to debate this with you because I've done this many times before, including with our tax council, but I think we probably ought not to do it here. But I understand your comments. I just disagree with them. It's looking at it myopically.
Thank you, Thanasi. Karina, you were in there?
Quick question for council. Can the board condition its approval of the appeal on plan sponsor agreement to pay the interest? So in other words, we approve it, but subject to approval of the city to cover the difference, the interest.
I suppose you could. It would be confusing for purposes of memorializing the minutes of what the actual action is, because that would be a future event. So what we've been asked to do is instead go ask the city, receive their answer, and then you could make a final decision at the March meeting. So I would personally recommend against making a conditional approval or decision based on another action in the future.
But if that were to occur, also interest would continue to accrue for Ms. Toomey.
Yes. Tom?
I just go back to responsibility. It's a city employee error. The city should share the responsibility with correcting it.
Thanasi?
Sorry. So let me just, maybe I want to make sure I
button wearing
explain
out
one
yet?
thing. Yeah, not yet. The fact of the matter is that what this board has always struggled with and why we haven't been able to really change our policy is because even under the IRS rules, the party that is responsible for taking care of these issues is the plan sponsor. And they have refused unilaterally to do it, unreasonably so. And we have not been in a position or decided to take any action against the plan sponsor, whether for various reasons. So I want to be really clear, because I know you mentioned that that we have a policy and the policy exists. The policy that we have exists because we are between a rock and a hard place because our plan sponsor has been unreasonable and inappropriate in their actions. They won't even hear whether or not she has a legitimate need to it. They're just saying, we're not going to do it. And I think that's irresponsible and inappropriate. So that's why we have the situation that we have, which does beg the question. I kind of like your idea, and I'll tell you why. Politically, it puts it right back in the lap of where it's supposed to be. We approve it if it's deserving to be approved, and you say, but the law says we can't do that without the plan sponsor making us whole, whether they do it through the UAL or whether they do it through a check separately. So great, you got our approval. City, there you go. Let them take the political heat for it. Let the issue fall directly where it belongs. Anyway, I don't know that I thought that out, but I've said it. Go ahead.
So I can appreciate the conditional approval, but like Mark alluded to and Johnny talked about some of the topics at the retreat, I would respectfully request that the board let this motion die from lack of a motion at this point. And then we can have that further discussion about going to the city for the request, and we can have that further discussion about the policy at the retreat and get more around this, get our minds around this a little bit more, because there is a little bit more to it. So with that, however, there is a motion up. There is no maker at this point. And I know David Toomey's here, and I think his desire to speak was based on a motion to deny being brought forth on the agenda. So if there's no motion, I think the issue would just die as it is, and we can have further discussion. And I think Mr. Toomey would be fine not commenting at this point. So did I get that accurate? Yes?
Well, I'd like to comment.
Oh. Okay. Yes. Thank you, Mr. Toomey. You have 2 minutes.
Okay, I agree with all the panel members, especially Mr. Tomasi, I guess.
The good-looking one in the bow tie?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's me.
But I do disagree with Mrs. Broad over here, who just keeps parroting the same city response over and over and over, that the city won't take responsibility for it. That's the old way. There's a new way we're doing it now. We can pay our bills. The city can pay their bills. The chargers are gone. We can pay the bills now. Let's do things the right way. Like Mr. Arolato suggests, the chairman of the Business and Governance Committee. That's all I have to say. Let's do things the right way. That's the right way to do things. And Mrs. Broad saying, let's do things the wrong way. And I'm saying, where's logic? Why do things the wrong way? There's a right way and a wrong way to do things. This is your chance to do it the right way. Let's do it the right way.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, so if there's no motion on this item, we will just move on to item number A6. All right, no motion. Item number A6 concerns retiree Robert Mulcahy's request to abate interest on an overpayment because the error was due to staff's negligence. Committee directed staff to approach the city for consideration of paying the interest. So again, there was no vote yesterday on Mr. Mulcahy, and a similar discussion to the Toomey case ensued. And so there was considerable discussion about the interest and how it's paid. However, it was conveyed clearly to Mr. Mulcahy that if he did pay the amount owed at this point, the interest would stop accruing, and he does preserve his right to still appeal the overpayment. So did I get all that right, Susan?
Yes, mostly.
Mostly? Okay.
So-
Hey, I'll take mostly. I'm living my life on mostly.
So Mr. Mulcahy's final average salary was overstated by $141 since 2003. And we corrected that error, and he has paid the principal, but he has not paid the interest. So he's appealing the interest portion. So if he pays the interest, then that part at this point, if it comes to a different determination later, could be refunded to him. But he has already paid the principal. I just want to clarify
Yes,
that.
Yes, he just refused to pay the interest at this point.
And so staff recommended to deny the appeal of Robert Mulcahy for similar reasons, although not for financial hardship, because he brings his appeal based on equity, and a similar discussion ensued, such as we just had for Ms. Toomey. I'd be happy to answer any further questions.
And nobody in the queue? All right, under new business, no action requested, there are 3 items.
Alan, could I just
Yes.
clarify procedurally? So staff does need directions on these appeals, so the fact that there was no action taken, I understand would come back in March?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Under new business, no action required. There are 3 items. Item B1, Johnny clarified that while the audit committee charter cites that trustees on the audit committee must be independent, that's in quotes, but that does not preclude an elected trustee from filling either of the 2 trustee positions on the 5-person audit committee. Item B2, Johnny clarified that the port and the airport's reporting of pensionable compensation is in compliance with PEPRA law. In item B3, Jessica Packard explained that SDCERS successfully completed its first electronic vote to elect Thomas Battaglia, and the elections and re-elections will be held in the next few months for the seats held by Jeff Wallace, Tom Battaglia again. Get to run 2 elections in a span of a few months, and yours truly. Under old business, action requested, there are 2 items. Item C1, Johnny presented a revised board rule on overpayments and underpayments to clarify the applicability of financial hardship arguments, as we were discussing, as they apply to the relevant IRS regulations. The committee directed staff to allot a portion of the time at the upcoming board retreat to discuss review and rewrite of the existing overpayment, underpayment policies. So no action was taken on that item at B&G yesterday. Also on item C2, Johnny Tran, with assistance from SDCERS broker Barney, presented an overview on cybersecurity measures in place at SDCERS and a quote for the insurance. And there was no action taken at B&G on that item either. So there was no recommendation for purchase of insurance. Under old business, on item C1, concerns an update on overpayments to members conceding $10,000. Marcel Rossman reported that member Tracy Williams resolved her underpayment subsequent to Marcel's staff report being written. Status reports, legal compliance, Johnny Tran gave his report and highlighted the staff is negotiating a contract with KPMG to review SDCERS tax compliance program and that the PSC cases are set for trial on August 25th. Information technology, David Bond reported that his area replaced security firewalls and other network equipment that was reaching end-of-life support. Also, Dave addressed 2 major findings from the simulated disaster recovery event conducted in October. First, a disaster event resolution was created to provide emergency purchasing authority to the CEO. It was passed by B&G unanimously and was on the consent agenda. Second, payroll processing steps in the disaster recovery document are now written in more detail. We plan to conduct another simulated disaster recovery exercise in March to validate our process that our process is documented in sufficient detail. Member services, Cynthia Queen complimented the call center appropriately, as we always do. They work very hard up there. And health teams for their excellent work on the annual Medicare reimbursement verification process for city retirees. This outreach mailing to 3,000 retirees increased the call volume in December by 30%, but call wait times remained low at an impressive 14 seconds. Benefits administration. Marcel Rossman reported a request for proposal for actuarial services is being drafted. It will include both actuarial services and an audit of actuarial services should Chiron be selected again. Finance. Ted reported that Finance has completed the fiscal year 2016 comprehensive annual financial report, and I believe that's all in our boxes back there.
It's in your cubbies back there.
Yes, some great reading. Okay, I lost my spot here. Okay, and file the report for the Certificate of Achievement Program with the Government Finance Officers Association, which we have won awards for on our CAFR in the past. Current priorities include the preparation of the annual 1099-R and W-2 tax forms for retirees or their beneficiaries, and the preparation of the fiscal year 2018 budget. Ted also presented the 2016 financial trust statements and the September 2016 year-to-date expenses, actual versus budget. Administrative expenses total $11.1 million for the 3 months ended September 30th, 5.5% under budget of $11.8 million. Information technology, fiduciary, and tax legal expenses and investment management fees were all under budget. October 16th, trust financial statements. As of October 31st, SDCERS had a net position of $6.9 billion and a total investments of $7.1 billion. For the 4 months ended October 31st, SDCERS had an increase in planned net position of $127 million, reflecting net investment income of $177 million. Contributions of $117 million and total expenses of $167 million. And that completes the B&G report. Bill?
Alan, could I have a little bit of insight into the cybersecurity insurance? I thought that was interesting. I guess we passed on it, did we?
Yeah, we did. It was presented without a staff recommendation, and in the presentation materials, there was a pretty detailed list of what we do now to protect our data and systems, and so it was a great discussion, and for me, it was helpful to know that the insurance wouldn't protect the assets. It really protected our liability costs if we had a breach and then we were subsequently sued as a result of that breach. And so the B&G committee felt that, and I'll let Tom and Carol speak for themselves as well, but I felt, though, that what we had in place and what David Bond explained in terms of what the Department of Homeland Security provides was we were in a good position in terms of cybersecurity, and the insurance wasn't needed.
Yeah, it was interesting reading that because of all the election stuff that's gone on, but the hackers are becoming so much more sophisticated now. They seem to be able to get through just about any firewall you can put up. But I guess, we're in pretty good shape, but it's scary to think of if they got into the system,
Right,
what they
right.
could do.
So I don't know if Mark or David, you want to comment more further on that, or do you think I covered it?
I will just add that, as Alan mentioned, there were a great number of things that we talked about what we're currently doing to adequately secure all of our member data. We did look at what other systems are doing. We reached out to the other 40 public pension systems in the state of California, and there are no systems that are our size or larger that have this insurance. The systems that do have cyber insurance are the smaller systems that may have a staff of 4 or 5, and if they had a data breach, they would be overwhelmed with the ability to be able to respond to that. Systems of our size or larger have resources internal to work on a data response plan. We have a data response plan. It's well documented, and there's just a number of measures we do. That's not to say that we don't believe insurance makes sense, and we'll revisit this issue from time to time. I think just currently, we didn't see the value that would provide that much incremental benefit to us over what we currently have in place.
And Alan touched upon the Department of Homeland Security. We are a participant in their program that will provide forensic analysis. They'll actually send a specialist team in to help us to remediate an issue and to resolve whatever issue that we have. So the DHS is providing the service free of charge.
Has there ever been...
free too, by the way.
Yes.
Has there ever been a breach of a pension system in the United States that we're aware of?
Russia just finished with the election. It's going to take them a little while. They'll get there.
They're
They'll
next.
get there.
We're next,
They're
right?
Next.
All right, I just thought...
There probably has, but I'm not aware of it.
All right. Any more on the B&G agenda? All right, moving on to Investment Committee. Bill?
Okay, we had our investment committee meeting yesterday. We have a few items to go over with the board. There were no action items, so these are updates or status reports. And we'll start with the GCM Grosvenor Wind and Sea Portfolio update.
Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all again, and a special welcome to Tom Battaglia, new trustee. So GCM Grosvenor was here yesterday and presented an update on the Wind and Sea portfolio. As you may remember, that was approved as an opportunistic credit mandate back in March of 2014. So we're due for an update to kind of inform you what's going on there. Let's see here. So right about now, there's about $131 million in the mandate across 16 manager funds. And they're spread out according to these two pie charts. So as you can see, very focused on corporate credit and mortgage-backed securities, and a pretty sizable chunk of the investment is with the US, Canada, and the European markets. And let's see here. And the corporate credit is mostly focused in the emerging market area, where the managers can take a activist role in some of the deals. Let's see here. And moving on to performance. So as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, it says since 06-14, there's been about a 3.81% return, annualized return. So the strategy started out a little bit slow, but it's picked up pace and performance-wise in the last year and a half, roughly. Standard deviation has been lower than anticipated, so that's helped in terms of looking at it from a risk-adjusted return perspective. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions if there are any.
I think it was a very interesting presentation because they make opportunistic investments and they can move in quickly, and a couple of them have done really well, like a 32% return on one on Pathfinders, but it was good. So now we'll, given that, we'll move on to a review and analysis of risk-adjusted returns.
Yep. So in the past, we've thought about, kind of the fund has been thinking about return and then risk, right? It's important to think about risk and return as one concept, as the risk-adjusted returns. So we don't just say, okay, we had this amount of return and that's great, but how much risk were we exposed to, and then compare it to peers. So Demetrius is going to kind of introduce the topic.
The purpose of this review.
There you go.
The purpose of this review was really to get a better understanding of how SDCERS is being compensated for the risk in the investment portfolio, which is a priority for the investment division in fiscal year 2017. So within that framework, there are three main goals that staff sought to achieve. The first was to determine how SDCERS is being compensated for the risk in the total fund level and how that compares to other public pension plans in the peer universe. And this was on both a historical and a forward-looking basis. For this portion, staff used a comparative study from Aon Hewitt. The second goal was to determine the risk-adjusted return of the within the asset class. And to accomplish this, staff conducted an analysis of each asset class's risk-adjusted return weighed against the benchmark. And finally, the third goal was to determine what can be done to improve the risk-adjusted return of the portfolio moving forward.
So when we look at these peer data reviews, it's important to remember that this is a point-in-time analysis. So, and we're looking at June 30th data. If we were to look at another time period, things could look completely different depending on what kind of asset class and what managers are in and out of favor at that point in time. So just keep that in mind when we go through the review. And it's also, as Demetrius pointed out, it's important to understand that Aon Hewitt's analysis was done on the total fund level, while staff's analysis was done on the asset class level, comparing it to the benchmark, while Aon Hewitt's was comparing it to peers. So the first analysis was done by Aon Hewitt, as we mentioned, and they used three approaches to their analysis. The first one was using historical review of index returns. So what's good about using index returns is that you can actually isolate asset allocation decisions without the noise of manager selection decisions. And in this approach, SDCERS had the highest Sharpe ratio, which means highest risk-adjusted return among its peers over the last 3, 5, and 10-year period. So that's proven that the asset allocation decisions made by the board has been additive to the risk-adjusted return. The second approach that Aon Hewitt took was using historical returns with historical review using actual returns, I should say. So here, manager selection decisions come into play, and over the last 3 years, we're in line with other peers, and over the last 5 years, we're trailing modestly, and this is because of the small cap bias that we have in the U.S. equity portfolio and a larger allocation than peers to emerging market debt, which over the last 5 years didn't do as well as the other peers. The peers' allocations were mostly to investment grade, non-US, and global fixed income, which did much better than emerging market debt. And the final review that Aon Hewitt did was, as Demetrius mentioned, using forward-looking returns. And as you can see in your analysis, SDCERS came out as having the best risk-adjusted return among its peers going forward over the next 10-year period. And then staff did the analysis of the risk-adjusted return on the asset class level compared to the benchmark. Now, in the investment committee meeting, we went through this in detail, but it's pretty time-consuming, so in the interest of time, I'm just going to perform a 30,000-foot overview level, if that's okay with everyone. So some of the positives were across all asset classes, manager selection was overall positive. There were some areas within non-US equities where there were some troubles with manager selection. Those managers were terminated fairly swiftly. The one was in 2013, I believe, that the board took action on. There were some structural issues, like the small cap bias, lack of emerging market equities in 2009 when that particular piece of the asset class did extremely well as market neutral managers that were housed within the US fixed income allocation that increased the perceived risk within that asset class. So when we did this review, there were some conclusions that we could draw from this, and some of them that I would like to highlight is number one, SDCERS asset allocation decisions have in the past and should in the future continue to add to the risk-adjusted returns of the plan. And number two, as I mentioned, there were some structural issues within the portfolio, but they were identified very quickly by staff and the consultant and then subsequently addressed by the board. And number three, going forward, staff and the consultants continue to bring best ideas to the board to increase and optimize the risk-adjusted return of the plan. With that said, I'll be happy to answer any questions if there are any.
No questions?
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anderson.
Okay, the next item is emerging markets update and commentary. And we had the investment committee received a review from PIMCO. PIMCO is one of our largest managers. They're one of the largest fixed income managers in the United States. And they did a very interesting, I just recap real quickly, very interesting summary of it all. Emerging markets, probably my guess is there's somewhere over $1 billion that we have in them if you take everything. There's emerging market debt, emerging market equity, global equities, global real estate, private equity, but there's a mix of emerging markets in all of that. And the first slide they kind of concentrated on was the major upheaval that has gone on within emerging markets over the last several years, including what they call the temper tantrum, and then the Russian-Ukraine conflict, the OPEC prices, oil prices dropping in half from $100 to $50, below that, one point to 25, the Fed hike recently, U.S. elections, Turkey coup, Brazil downgrade. There's a whole lot of things going on out there. And what he kind of did was he focused on what he called the 3 C's, China, commodities, and central bank. So China is a huge player now, with their GDP being number 1 or 2 in the world. And they are part of what you call the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, emerging markets. Now they're coming out of the emerging market phase. They now have their own basket of currencies and SDR rights and so forth. So they're worth following. And so he made a point that was a big one that we need to look at. Commodity prices, as we all saw when oil went from 100 to 50 to 25 back to 50, markets move dramatically, and so that's a big one. And then central banks, the central banks are, with particularly the Fed, let's say, when we raise interest rates, has a major impact on foreign emerging market debt. So those are things to look at. And then he kind of went in and focused on the last slide about negatives, neutrals, and positives. And I'll just look at the negatives for a second. higher U.S. treasuries wind up being a negative in emerging markets. And the risk of protectionism can be a negative, and the stronger U.S. dollar could be a negative. But it was a good presentation, gave us kind of some sense for a major part of our portfolio and what we might be looking at in the future. So with that, I think we'll move on now to the annual review of cash overlay program. Demetrius?
Representatives from Parametric were at the investment committee meeting yesterday to give the annual review of the cash overlay program. To briefly summarize, SDCERS does not have a target cash allocation. However, it is necessary to have cash in the portfolio to pay benefits or fund capital calls, for example. And so to compensate for the fact that cash in the portfolio is expected to exert a performance drag, SDCERS hired Parametric in December of 2008 to implement the cash overlay program. And since inception, the program has performed quite favorably, generating $172.5 million net of fees. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
This definitely is a great program, and I think, Liza, compliment you and the investment team for putting this in. That we just have money sitting there we can be earning money on. They now call it administrative alpha, kind of like that. We now have a structured alpha program and an administrative alpha program, but we want alpha. All right, with that, I think we'll move on now to the update on the California Assembly Bill 2833.
The interesting part of the meeting. So just a quick update on, as we call it, AB 2833. Essentially, it's a fee reporting requirement for all California public plans for their private market investments, which include private equity, infrastructure, and real estate. And really the goal is to increase the transparency of fees paid in that sector of the market. This bill is effective January 1st of this year and applies to all new investments made on or after January 1st of 2017. Any existing investments where we are still funding capital, and then we also have to make a best efforts attempt at providing this information on all existing investments. So what will we be reporting? One, investment fees paid on the underlying funds in private equity and infrastructure, as well as for real estate. We also have to report other operational fees that are incurred in the operation of the partnership. So that can include anything from partnership startup fees, it can be audit expenses, travel. There's a variety of things that can be included in that figure. Then we also have to report carried interest, which is the general partner's share of the profits. And then we will provide a total fee summary of all those three items. And then we also have to report returns on a net and a gross of fees basis. We expect to report this out after the end of the fiscal year. That would probably be once we compile all of the data, and I'm expecting that would probably be at the November board meeting. And then just lastly, all of our consultants and advisors have been notified of this new California law and have been directed that they will have to comply with these reporting requirements. And I can take any questions.
So it's not so much a burden on us, it's more of a burden on the funds that have
Correct.
to report it. And we do gather those fees, so we see them in the financial statements under all the different categories here, but this will be a new breakout.
Right.
Okay, and now we'll move on to Deutsche Bank, asset management, real estate separate accounts, and where we are there with an update.
As you recall, we are transitioning out of this separate account, and there's really two pieces of it. The first piece is we have 10 properties that we're looking to swap for shares of another core open-end real estate fund. And where we are in that process is Deutsche has engaged an outside consultant to complete external appraisals of those 10 properties, and that's been completed. They have also updated the rent rolls and leasing information for all of those properties, and that data has been populated in the data room. And they have currently 4 firms who are actively looking at these 10 properties and 3 other firms who are reviewing them. Bids on these properties are due by January 25th, and we're going to have a phone call next week to see if there are any updates, and then obviously shortly after they receive bids to determine where we are and what are the next steps. The second piece of this is there are 9 properties that we're going to sell outright. And I got an update yesterday from Deutsche Asset Management, and the process is actually moving along faster than expected. There is 1 retail property that's currently under contract to be sold. There's another property, a business center, that they just received bids on yesterday. There's a 3rd property, an industrial property, that they expect to receive bids on in February. And then there are 2 additional properties that they expect to go to market to probably sometime this spring, and that's an industrial property and an apartment property. And then I've just recently had a call with our consultant to set up a meeting to strategize what's our plan going to be going forward with how to redeploy the assets or the cash that we receive from the sale of those assets. So that gives you an update where we are in that process.
So this is all good news. We're right on target, following the plan. It's even moving ahead a little faster
Right.
As of yesterday. Yeah. Okay, thank you, Liza.
Mm-hmm.
Now we'll go into the Aon Hewitt's Total Fund Performance Report for the quarter ended September 2016.
Hello again. Nice to see you again. So, continuing the good news all around, on slide 8, as you can see, for the quarter, the total fund returned 3.9% versus the 3.4 of the benchmark, so a 0.4% outperformance. And the next page, you can see kind of a little bit what we talked about earlier with the risk-adjusted returns. Here you can see a chart that shows where it says 90-day treasury bill. That's referring to the risk-free asset, and the total fund policy benchmark would be kind of the market return, and the line in between there is any combination of those two. So that's called the capital market line. You want to be in the upper left-hand corner, and as you can see, the total fund is slightly above the line, which is always good news. And let's see here. Moving on to slide 13. Just thought I would sneak this in here because it's not too frequent you see positive numbers overall asset classes, overall time periods. I know we look at it on a relative basis, but absolute returns are always nice when they're positive. And so the final slide that I wanted to show you was the third quarter 2016 attribution. So as you can see, most of the outperformance came from the selection effect, which is what we like to see. Asset allocation effect is more has to do with how we're positioned versus the benchmark in terms of over-underweights in the asset classes. And that should be a fairly nominal number going forward and over time. So with that said, if there are any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them on the performance.
Okay, thank you, Anders. And finally here, we move to Investment Division staff reports.
So the reconciled market valuation as of November 30th was $7.062 billion. And since the last board meeting, 8 wires were sent out, totaling about $6.9 million to pay for payroll payments and operating expenses. And 2 wires were sent out in the amount of approximately $84 million in October and November to pay for monthly benefit payments to retirees and beneficiaries. And since the last board meeting, actually on December 20th, staff initiated a rebalancing action for about $120 million to come out of U.S. equities as we were about to hit the upper rebalancing limit on that asset class. That 120 million was subsequently redeployed to 2 U.S. fixed income managers, split 50-50 between TCW and the BlackRock Intermediate Aggregate Index Fund. And the last board meeting, I believe it was the last board meeting, that we approved the Brookfield Real Estate Finance Fund 5. We walked away from that due to material disagreements in the contract negotiations, and that was communicated to the investment committee, the board president and the vice president on December 14th, but it bears importance to report that out to everyone else there too. So with that said, if there are any questions?
What you might do, just talk about the increase. So the increase from June 30th to September 30th was largely due to a couple things. We went to $7 billion from 6.6 or whatever it was, and that was because of the two major things: the payment that we received from the city, I think that was July 1st maybe.
Yep.
And that was about 170 million.
270.
And then about 240 million, was it, in investment returns?
Oh, yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
Just to clarify that,
Yeah.
the city's contribution does not, no, it's not. Anyway, the city's contribution does not go towards performance.
Right.
So that 3.9% does not include the increase in market value that came from that contribution.
Right. Just looking at the cash. Okay, and that concludes the investment committee report.
All right, thank you, Bill. Training, Johnny?
Thanks, Alan. So Mark has reached out to each trustee to form a customized training schedule. And we've heard back from several trustees and would like to get the board's approval for these training courses.
Okay.
So the courses are in your material. So the motion would be to approve the training courses in the material that you have in front of you.
Okay. So we'll need a button.
Well, I'll need a first and a second now.
There we go. So I have a motion of Tom Battaglia, and I seconded the motion to approve the conferences.
Ready to vote? All votes are in.
And that motion passed 10-0.
That's it. Thanks, Alan.
All right, thank you. We have no approvals for attendance at any courses that were preloaded?
Well, it was in your material.
You just did them all as one?
I did.
Okay.
On the one-offs, we used to type it in, but because there's so many, we attached that as part of the public materials.
Okay.
And
Gotcha.
so what I had just asked to vote on was approval of all those items.
Okay, I'm sorry, I apologize. I misunderstood that motion to mean approval of the classes that were available. So
sorry
now
about
that I
that.
understand, so I do approve of those as well, so, thank you. All right, moving on to comments from board, staff.
I'm looking at Carol. Did you have a further question on training?
No, I just have to do some research. I failed to mention that with my schedule, I would have 5 in this year, which exceeds kind of the norm. I didn't know if I had to bring that to anybody's attention.
Yeah, to Carol's point
Approved,
is
yeah.
that your policy says that generally an experienced trustee should take 4 courses. But in case where it's need, sometimes that goes over, and it has gone over in the past. But thank you for bringing that to the
Out of
board's
curiosity
attention,
on that policy, I mean, for me, it's kind of been like in every other year. I kind of do 1 or 2 in one year, and then I do more in another year. Is it an average issue, or is it actually literally a cap per year?
It's a suggestion.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. It should be noted for the record that Johnny said I suggested courses that were specific to your particular needs, and that Thanasi took none of my recommendations.
I ignored all of them. Yes, I did. 4 years I've attended those conferences. I'm not going to some of them.
Why does that not surprise me?
I did have a couple other things that I wanted to mention. First, we went through the whole meeting, and I should have said something earlier about Tom Battaglia joining our board today. Tom is a senior budget development analyst for the city of San Diego, in the financial management department. He's been with the city since 2002, for quite a while. Had positions with Park and Rec, Fire Rescue, and Public Works. So we're very glad to have him on the board, so thank you. Tom and Jeff and Alan's terms all come due at the end of March, so they'll all be rerunning for their seats.
Yes, I will.
Yep. Second, there was an item towards the end of the last meeting that we discussed salary survey information for the CEO position. Luli had presented some information. Natasha had asked a question about whether the increases that were disclosed in the covered California information were merit increases or promotional increases. And the information that Covered California presents does not tell you what type of an increase that was.
Transparent California.
Sorry, Transparent California. I said the wrong thing. Transparent California. So in the absence of knowing what they were, Luli had observed that the person was in the same position at the beginning of the year as at the end of the year, so assumed it was just a merit increase. Subsequent to the board meeting, we did hear from the city of San Diego that confirmed that those increases that were in Transparent California were in fact promotional increases that Luli had represented to you. So Luli had reached out to two different entities within the city to try to confirm this information before the meeting, didn't get a response, so unfortunately she was a little bit restricted in being able to have the best data available for you. So I apologize for any misunderstanding of that material. So I did send a communication out to you about that before. I just wanted to make sure we were on the record of saying that that was an inadvertent mix-up on that information. And then last, we talked about it a couple different times. We do have a board retreat that's coming up February 16th. All 12 of you are committed to coming, so that is great. I shared with you the agenda materials. We'll be talking about a benchmarking survey. You'll be getting that survey to you in advance of the board meeting so you can see what type of things were discussed. The second thing is we'll be having two members from the Chiron actuarial team, David Holland, whom you saw here today, along with Bill Hallmark, who is a senior actuary with Chiron. They'll be here to kind of do an actuarial Q&A of anything and everything that you would like to understand from an actuarial point of view. There were a number of things brought up today which you may want to bring up again, and anything else that you think of that you would like them to talk about, they'll be ready to do that. I would ask if you have any suggestions or questions that you would like them to be specifically prepared to discuss, that you let me know via email or a phone call, and I'll make sure that they address that. And then finally, as we talked about on the overpayments thing, we called an audible at yesterday's business and governance meeting, and we're going to start the board retreat earlier at 7:30 rather than 8:30. For that first hour, for those of you who can make it, we were going to give you the historical context of our overpayment policy. How did we get to where we're at? And then talk about whether there are some opportunities for revising it. I know a number of you aren't happy with it. I certainly don't want you to think staff is happy with this policy either. We believe it's a policy that we've been required to follow and are sort of reluctant participants in following it as well. So we're obviously open to your input on that.
I'll speak for myself. I'm not, the policy I understand, because I guess maybe because I've been here. It's just one of those policies that when you execute the policy, it's just painful. And it's just difficult. But there's nothing wrong with reviewing the policies and revising them, especially as board members change and as our views change. So thank you for that.
Yep.
Any other comments from board? Okay. No non-docket items, and then closed session, Johnny?
Yeah, we have about 5 minutes, so if you'll just stay in your seat, we'll do closed session for 5 minutes.
Okay, so we will go to closed session.
Usually at a tea time at noon, yes. Sure. Yeah. I'll be up there. You can wait here.
I bought this jacket, I can wear it 3 days a year. Damn it, I'm wearing it.
Alan, you're ready to convene.
Okay, coming out of closed session on January 13th, SDCERS Board has nothing to report. Therefore, we are now adjourned.